Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Always exciting to be back.
Today we're going to be talking about a pretty heavy hitter in political thought,
Oh, yeah.
Thomas Hobbes.
Thomas Hobbes, a big one.
Um, and specifically, we're going to be looking at his book, Leviathan,
Leviathan.
which, as I'm sure a lot of you know, is considered a foundational text
Oh,
uh,
absolutely.
for Western political thought.
It's one of those books that every student of political science or international relations has to grapple with.
It's so influential, and I think especially for our listeners who are deep in their UPSC studies
Yeah.
and really focusing on international relations.
Yes.
This is
This is key.
a text that can really unlock
Yeah.
a lot of those core concepts.
It can be a real secret weapon in your UPSC arsenal.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that we always talk about on the show is it's not just about, memorizing dates and names and facts and figures.
Right.
It's about understanding the ideas
Absolutely.
behind.
It's about getting into the heads of these thinkers.
Exactly.
Figuring out why they thought what they thought and how those ideas still shape the world today.
Exactly. And Hobbes is such a
He's
fascinating thinker.
a fascinating and challenging thinker. I mean,
Right.
he really tries to wrestle with this fundamental paradox
Okay.
of individual freedom and the need for a strong ruler, even an absolute one.
So that's what I wanted to start with, because
Yeah.
this idea of an absolute ruler,
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty intense.
You've got to remember the context.
Like,
Hobbes was writing during a time of massive upheaval.
right, he was living through the English Civil War.
Exactly, a bloody, brutal civil war.
Yeah.
So when he looked around at the world, what he saw was what he called the state of nature.
Okay, the state of nature.
Picture a world without laws, without police, without any kind of authority.
Oh, wow.
Just imagine that for a second.
Okay, so anarchy, basically.
Anarchy, pure chaos, everyone just looking out for themselves.
I mean, yeah, I can see how living through a civil war,
Right.
that would definitely
It would shape your worldview.
shape your worldview and, I guess, lead you to maybe some extreme conclusions.
And that's exactly what Hobbes did.
Okay, so what was his solution?
He proposed what he called a social contract.
Okay.
Individuals willingly give up some of their freedom to an absolute ruler in exchange for security and order.
So basically trading a little freedom for a lot of security.
Exactly. Choosing the lesser of two evils.
I mean, that's a pretty big trade-off.
It is a big trade-off.
But I can see how, in that context, it might have seemed,
Appealing.
necessary even.
Necessary even.
Okay, so this is where the Leviathan comes in,
Yeah, exactly.
right? The big guy on the cover of the book.
Right. The iconic image, the giant figure made up of all those tiny people.
Yeah, it's a striking image.
It really is.
And it's supposed to represent.
The sovereign, the absolute ruler.
So it's like all the individuals coming together
Yeah.
to create this powerful entity.
Pooling their power
Right.
to create something bigger than themselves.
But hold on a second. Didn't Hobbes also believe in individual liberty?
Ah, there's the rub.
Because this whole absolute ruler thing seems a bit,
Contradictory.
a little bit at odds with that.
Right.
Like, how do those two ideas...
Well, it's definitely a paradox.
Okay.
And this is what makes Hobbes so fascinating.
Yeah.
His philosophy has elements of both liberalism and illiberalism.
So he's kind of all over the place.
Well, not exactly. He's trying to find a balance, a way to reconcile these seemingly contradictory ideas.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's break it down then. What's the liberal side of Hobbes?
On the one hand, he stresses individual consent as the basis of legitimate government.
Okay, so the government's power ultimately comes from the people.
Exactly.
That makes sense. That's
All right.
pretty liberal.
And there's more.
Okay.
Hobbes even carves out a private sphere
A private sphere.
where the state can interfere.
Interesting. Okay.
Think of things like your thoughts, your personal beliefs, even your economic activities.
So it's like he's saying, okay, I'll give you absolute power,
Right.
but you can't mess with my personal stuff.
You can't tell me what to think or believe.
Okay, so that's pretty liberal.
It is.
But what about the illiberal side?
Well, that's where the absolute ruler comes in.
Okay, lay it on me.
For Hobbes, the sovereign's power is ultimately unchecked.
Unchecked.
There are no real mechanisms for active citizen participation or for holding the ruler accountable.
So basically the ruling can do whatever they want.
Well, within the limits of maintaining order.
Okay, because that's the whole point, right?
Exactly. The sovereign's primary duty is to provide security.
But still, it seems like that opens the door for...
Potential tyranny.
Yeah.
Critics argue that this concentration of power without any checks and balances is a recipe for disaster.
So we've got this individual giving up some freedom for security.
Right.
And the ruler gets absolute power to maintain order.
That's the core of Hobbes's argument.
And this is still relevant today.
Oh, absolutely,
Oh, yeah.
especially in international relations.
Okay, but before we get into that, I have to ask,
Yeah.
even with an absolute ruler,
Right.
does the individual have any rights that can't be violated?
No, that's where it gets even more interesting.
Okay, I'm all ears.
For Hobbes, even under an absolute sovereign, the individual retains one crucial right,
Which is
the right to
the
self-preservation.
right to self-preservation.
Exactly.
So even the absolute ruler can't just,
Can't force someone to kill themselves, for example.
whoa. Okay, that's a pretty big exception to absolute power.
It is.
So even the absolute ruler has limits.
Exactly.
And this raises another important question.
Go on.
If the sovereign fails to protect an individual,
Okay.
does that invalidate the social contract?
That's a great question.
Does the individual then have a right to resist?
It's this kind of nuanced thinking that will really make your answer stand out in the UPSC exam.
Okay, so we've got individual rights, absolute power,
Right.
and even a right to resist if the ruler fails to protect you.
Hobbes is full of surprises.
This is pretty mind-blowing stuff.
What?
It is. But what about liberty in general?
Yeah.
How did Hobbes define that?
Good question.
Was it like, do whatever you want kind of freedom?
Not quite.
Okay.
For Hobbes, liberty is not about doing whatever you want.
So what is it about?
It's about freedom from coercion existing within the boundaries set by law.
So freedom within limits.
Exactly.
Okay.
Think about freedom of speech, for example.
Yeah.
For Hobbes, you're free to think whatever you want,
Okay.
but the sovereign decides what you can actually say publicly.
So there's a distinction between,
Of thought and action.
right, between freedom of thought
Right.
and freedom of expression.
Precisely.
So it's freedom within limits.
Exactly.
And this connects directly to contemporary debates
Oh, absolutely.
about the balance between individual freedoms and state power.
Right.
How much freedom are we willing to sacrifice for security?
That's the eternal question.
And it's a question that Hobbes was grappling with
Centuries ago.
centuries ago.
And we're still grappling with it today.
It's amazing how these ideas from so long ago are still
So relevant.
so relevant to the world we live in.
They are.
This is fascinating stuff.
It is.
It feels like we're just scratching the surface of Hobbes' ideas.
Oh, we are.
And you know what's really cool?
What's that?
We can see echoes of Hobbes.
Echoes.
And another political thinker you'll definitely need to know for your UPSC exams,
Oh, who's that?
Machiavelli.
Machiavelli. Ah, yes.
So how do these two thinkers connect?
Well, both Machiavelli and Hobbes recognize the role of self-interest in politics.
Okay, so they both had a pretty,
Realistic.
realistic view of human nature.
They weren't idealists.
Right.
They saw the world as it is.
Okay, but how did they differ?
While Machiavelli was more focused on the practicalities of power,
Okay,
how to acquire it and maintain it.
so like a how-to guide for rulers.
In a way, yes, he was very pragmatic.
Okay, and what about Hobbes?
Hobbes, on the other hand, was searching for a unifying principle to manage competing interests.
And he landed on
The absolute sovereignty.
the Leviathan.
Exactly.
So we have individual liberty, the absolute power of the sovereign.
Right.
This is definitely complex,
It is.
but it feels like we're starting to piece together this Hobbesian puzzle,
One piece at a time.
one piece at a time.
We'll get there.
We'll get there.
And here's where things get really interesting for those of you studying international relations.
Okay, hit me.
This idea of self-preservation, it's not just for individuals.
Correct.
Hobbes believed that states, too, act out of self-interest.
So you're saying countries are basically like individuals,
Exactly. Just like those individuals in the state of nature.
but there's no world government,
Right.
so no one to enforce the rules.
Precisely. It's what we call an anarchic system.
Anarchy, so it's every country for itself.
In a sense, yes.
Okay, but don't we have things like the UN,
We
international law, all these things that try to bring some order?
Sure, but Hobbes would argue that those institutions are only as strong as the states that support them.
So even with those institutions,
There's still that underlying tension.
this struggle for power.
Exactly. States are always calculating how to maximize their own security.
So it's like a constant game of chess.
A very high-stakes game of chess.
Wow, this is pretty intense.
It is, but that's the reality of international relations.
So for our listeners prepping for the UPSC,
Yes.
Hobbes is basically giving us a framework for understanding why countries do what they do.
Precisely.
Okay, I'm starting to see the connections here.
Good.
But let's get specific.
Sure.
How does this all play out in real-world scenarios?
Well, think about current debates on things like humanitarian intervention
Also.
or the role of the UN.
Right.
Are there times when a powerful state or an international body should intervene in another country's affairs?
Even if it infringes on that country's sovereignty.
Exactly. That's a very Hobbesian dilemma.
So Hobbes is giving us a way to think about some of the toughest questions.
Some of the most fundamental questions in international relations.
This is pretty mind-blowing stuff.
It is, and it's what makes studying political philosophy so rewarding.
Okay, but let's go back to that image of the Leviathan for a moment.
Sure.
It represents the power of the state, this idea that individuals come together to create this powerful entity
Right.
that can protect them from chaos.
From the state of nature.
But could a modern-day Leviathan even work?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
In our globalized world, I mean,
With all its complexities.
with all its complexities and competing interests.
Exactly. Could a single, all-powerful entity effectively govern a world like ours?
It feels like we're moving beyond the scope of a single state
We are.
and into the realm of global governance.
Precisely.
Is that where Hobbes' ideas lead us?
That's for you to decide.
Okay, I like that.
That's the beauty of engaging with these classic thinkers.
Yeah.
They force us to confront questions that are still relevant centuries later.
So Hobbes is giving us the tools
The intellectual tools.
to analyze not just the world as it is,
Right.
but also the world as it could be.
Exactly.
Okay, future diplomats, let's recap what we've covered so far. Hobbes highlights this fundamental tension
Yes.
between individual freedom and the need for order.
A tension that's at the heart of international relations.
His idea of the state of nature
Yes.
helps us understand why countries act the way they do on the global stage.
Even with international organizations trying to bring some stability.
And his work challenges us to think about the nature of power and sovereignty,
Not just within states.
but also on a global scale.
Precisely.
Could there be a global Leviathan?
Could there be?
What form would it take?
What indeed?
And could it truly bring order to a world where self-interest is still a driving force?
These are the big questions.
These are the big questions, and they're exactly the kind of things you should be thinking about as you prepare for the UPSC exam.
Absolutely.
Understanding Hobbes isn't just about memorizing his theories.
No, it's not.
It's about applying them to real-world situations.
And using them to analyze those complex global challenges.
Exactly. This is amazing. It feels like we've gone way beyond just, cramming for an exam.
Absolutely.
And we're actually talking about, the nature of power and the future of global politics.
That's the power of political philosophy, isn't it?
It is.
It's not just an academic exercise. It's a way to engage with the big questions that have shaped human history.
And that continue to shape our world today.
Exactly.
So to bring it back to our listeners, those future diplomats out there
Yes.
who are prepping for the UPSC,
Right.
what are the key takeaways they should remember from our deep dive into Hobbes?
Well, I think first and foremost, remember that Hobbes highlights this fundamental tension between individual freedom and the need for order.
Yeah.
And that tension, it's at the heart of so many issues in international relations.
Absolutely. And then there's his concept of the state of nature,
Right.
which helps us understand why countries act the way they do on the global stage.
Even in the presence of international institutions.
Right, like the UN.
Exactly.
And finally,
Yeah.
his work pushes us to grapple with these big questions about power and sovereignty.
In a globalized world,
Right, could a global Leviathan really work?
what would it look like?
These are questions that future diplomats need to be thinking about.
They absolutely do.
This has been an amazing deep dive.
It has.
It's really made me think about Hobbes
in a new light.
in a whole new light.
It's not just historical context.
Yeah.
His ideas are so relevant to understanding the world today.
And honestly, there's no better way to prepare for the UPSC
I agree.
than by engaging with these classic thinkers.
It's not about memorizing facts and figures.
No?
It's about developing those critical thinking skills.
Right.
And the ability to apply these concepts to real-world situations.
Yeah.
And that's what Hobbes is all about.
So to all our listeners out there, those future diplomats hard at work.
Yes.
That was our deep dive into Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan.
We covered a lot of ground.
We explored this whole tension between individual liberty and absolute power.
Yeah.
The idea of the social contract, the right to self-preservation, and even the possibility of a global Leviathan.
It's heady stuff.
It is, and I hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking.
And maybe even a little bit mind-blowing.
Absolutely, because this is just the beginning of your journey into political philosophy.
There's so much more to explore.
Oh yeah, in Hobbes' work and in the works of other great thinkers who have wrestled with these timeless questions.
Exactly.
So keep those brains engaged.
Yes, keep thinking, keep questioning,
Keep asking those tough questions.
and keep preparing for those UPSC exams.
We're confident that you'll be ready to tackle any challenge that comes your way.
You got this.
And hey, before you go,
Yes.
hit that subscribe button and give us a like if you found this deep dive helpful.
We appreciate your support.
We do. We've got a whole lineup of topics coming your way.
All designed to help you ace those exams.
And become the brilliant diplomats you were born to be.
We believe in you.
Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.